Hello and welcome. This is Mr. Arvites, and we are on period 2 of AP US history. So in this video, we're going to look at a couple different things, mostly the formation of the British colonies. And this is something really a foundational point of AP US and really any US history class, but we'll do a quick little overview of this. This is going to be part 1 of a 3-video set. So Unit 2, AP US, we're looking at 1607 to 1754. Now, some people always ask, and I think the biggest thing to ask is, why do the British wait so long? Christopher Columbus comes to the New World 1492. There are some minor explorations that take place throughout the 1500s, but there's no permanent settlement until Jamestown. And the reason for that is English politics. English politics are a mess. And if you've taken an AP World class or European history class or anything else, or even if you don't know, the 1500s are a hot mess for England. Obviously, you have Henry VIII, and he goes through a whole bunch of problems. When he dies, we get Queen Mary, then we get Queen Elizabeth, and it goes through this whole thing. And so Britain is going through a lot of issues in terms of development. Now, what is developing, though, is a very strong merchant class and a very strong merchant economy, and that's going to be really the foundation of their push forward. I think it's important to show a difference between the Portuguese and Spanish, because those were really government-sponsored ventures. And what we're going to find here in the British colonies is that these really aren't that government-sponsored. They're more conglomerates. The Virginia Company, for instance, is going to pull together money to do this. Now, they get sponsored by the king. That's where they get their charters and everything else from. But at the end of the day, these are merchant ventures to make capital profit. Now, as Britain comes forward through the 1600s, it becomes very available in terms of colonial prospects. And I think one of the big misconceptions that people always have, and I know my students for years have always had this misconception, is why are the colonies founded, the British North American colonies? And generally speaking, the number one thing people say is going to be religion. And while religion is important, I think it's important to note that the first colony, Jamestown, is really not about religion. This is about money. This is about finances. And what I think you'll find is that the majority of colonists who come into Virginia in particular, and really any of the southern colonies, are going to be coming for financial reasons, whether they are indentured servants hoping to get land at the end of a contract, or they are land prospectors hoping to get land for either mining or eventually tobacco farming and other cash crops. In the northern areas, we do see a lot of colonies that are started for religious freedom. So I don't want you to think that the religious freedom thing is not important. It is very important. What I'm trying to get at is that people came for a variety of reasons. History is very rarely a one-size-fits-all shop, and in this case, it definitely isn't. And so depending on what colony we're talking about, it could be for religion. Pennsylvania for Quakers, the Puritans obviously in Massachusetts. Or it could be financial in Virginia, let's say. Virginia was definitely a financially based colony. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. But then you look at a colony like Maryland, which was founded by Catholics. Okay, and so I think these are all very important distinctions to get at and to understand that there are a lot of reasons that are getting people to go. Now, what are the push factors? A push factor is why people leave someplace. Because keep in mind, to uplift their entire lives and go across the ocean into an unforeseen world, why would people do it? Well, one, a lot of people were lied to as to what they would find. The advertisements by various companies as they were colonizing usually were fictitious, and they really made it seem like they were going to a paradise. Keep in mind, within a calendar year, 50% of the first 100 people who land in Virginia are dead. And so that's, I think, something very important to kind of understand, is that this is a very hard process. So people can be kind of duped into it. But for the people in the Virginia Company, a lot of it dealt with the society in England. So in England, throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s, we have a lot of things that are kind of factoring in. One is going to be obviously religious persecution. The Anglican Church, not really too fond of Catholics, not really going to be too fond of Puritans, though obviously the English Civil War will change a little bit of that in the mid-1600s. So that can all get kind of shaken up. But another big factor is going to be enclosures. Enclosure laws that took place during these time periods are also going to factor in. A lot of people who leave, especially in the late 1600s, are leaving because the land they used to farm is now going to be enclosed for nobility, and they're going to fence it off, and they're not going to let as many people farm on it anymore. And so they're going to be forced out into cities, and then from the cities they go into debt, and then indentured servitude on over. So that's another big factor, I think, that's really important to kind of understand. The lack of social mobility in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, I think is something that's a real factor for a lot of people as well. The idea, especially once these colonies are established, and again, we're not talking about the first group that came over, but as people continue to come over, the reality was you could take some money, invest in some land, and you could become very, very wealthy and be kind of the ruler of your own kingdom. And I think that was something really lucrative to people. There is an optimism with coming over in that your life will be better than the one that you left. And I think that's something that's ultra important. So let's talk about the first colony that came to be. Now, some people, and again, this happens all the time in U.S. history classes all across the country. Teachers will say, "Hey, first British colony," and people immediately will either rattle off Christopher Columbus's ships or they will rattle off the Mayflower. Neither one of those are correct, right? We get the Virginia Company, which is a joint stock company, right? This is a group of investors who pool together money to fund an expedition to form a colony in the Virginia territory, okay? This is going to be known as Jamestown. King James I is ruler of England. Virginia, the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth, all that fun stuff. And so they come over and they're going to come into essentially a wilderness. When they land in Virginia, things are not great. They are going to dice it up a little bit with some natives. They fend them off, and the relationship between colonists and natives are going to be kind of hit or miss. The French, for instance, usually got along with Native Americans. They traded fur. They had very little in terms of like huge plantations until the 1700s, and really they're doing fur trading and everything else. That made sense. As Virginia grows, while they had good relations with the natives in the first couple of years, the plantations eventually eat into it. An event that takes place in the 1670s, Bacon's Rebellion, is literally over a guy who wants to go take over territory held by Native Americans, and the colony telling him no, so he rebels over it. Not the most noble of rebellions. But either way, when the settlers landed at Jamestown, and the majority of these are single males, they land, they build a fort. That's the first thing they do immediately. They do have some guns, and they immediately form your first militia. This is really important to understand because this is very much a foundational unit, and the idea of militias being formed in these colonies is going to immediately go forward. Now, a lot of people talk about John Smith as being the big guy, and if you saw the Disney movie Pocahontas, you might say, "Oh, he fell in love with Pocahontas." Not true. John Smith's story is a whole hot mess. He ends up getting kicked out of Jamestown at a certain point in time, largely because people were dying in large quantities. So what caused settlers to die? Well, one, a lack of food. The original settlers for Jamestown came because they thought it was going to be a mining expedition. Remember, they're hearing about these massive silver ships coming back and forth from the Spanish-controlled Central and South America, so they assume that's what they're going to get. They didn't bring the proper farming tools, so they are starving. There is disease that goes through as well. Now, these diseases will be way worse for the Native Americans. And some people always ask, well, how come Native Americans seem to die in these larger quantities from infectious disease while the inhabitants of the colonies did not? Well, yes and no. Keep in mind, again, within a calendar year, 50 out of 100 are dead, but more boats are going to come in. As immunities are built up to both diseases from the United States, or from the Americas rather, and from Europeans, natives die in higher quantities because they have been isolated from European, Asian, and African diseases. And so as those diseases come, it really wrecks their immune system. And this is going to result in essentially military losses for Native Americans. In every major instance that we look at where Native Americans fought colonials, whether it be the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, and they lose, it's usually because populations are being ravaged by disease. And that happens. And that's an unintended consequence, though sometimes intended, depending on what the British are doing at the time, but largely unintended. Now, so what makes Jamestown successful? For a while, for the first 4 or 5 years, it is a horrible colony. Nothing is working. And then in comes a guy named John Rolfe. John Rolfe is very famous because he's going to introduce tobacco into Jamestown. Tobacco will transform Jamestown from a fledgling, failing colony where people go to die to something that is going to be worth millions of dollars on the global market. Tobacco was a product that was largely monopolized by the Spanish and Portuguese. Rolfe gets some seeds, plants tobacco. Turns out Virginia was great for planting tobacco, and they're able to grow large portions of it, and they sell it in Europe. And Rolf, within 4 years, is essentially not working anymore. He has other people doing the work for him. Now, where does that come into play? Indentured servants are going to come into the New World in large quantities to help facilitate these plantations. But the other big thing is going to be in 1619, the first African-American slaves are going to be brought over, or African slaves are going to be brought over to North America, and they will be put to work in Jamestown on these plantations. African slavery in Jamestown starts 1619, and it's going to progress and grow and grow and grow as the years go on. For the first 25 or so years of the colonies, though, most slaves would have been indentured servants. However, I think, and I'm going to put up a graph here, this graph kind of shows you what happens in Jamestown. And this graph shows you pounds and thousands of tobacco that is grown. And you can see it exponentially grows. And then from 1618 to 1620, we see that it more than doubles. And that's largely because of the implementation of slaves, both indentured servants and, of course, slaves from Africa. And then they have dips, largely due to disease, and then a huge increase as the slave trade becomes more normalized. That's something that had to occur in Jamestown, or it didn't have to occur, but it did occur in Jamestown to progress this, is that the slave trade, docking, and everything else became more normalized in terms of the quantity of slaves that were coming in. I think it's important to understand, and sometimes people get lost in this kind of conversation about slavery, and people forget that, indentured servitude, by and large, people signed up for indentured servitude, right? They would sign labor contracts. These labor contracts might be 5, they could be 7, they could be 8 years. Sometimes they were getting out of debt. Sometimes they were in jail. Sometimes they were just people who wanted to get a ride and try and make something of themselves. They had it hard, but make no mistake, from the very beginning, Jamestown is going to draw a color line, and they will divide in class, socio-class slaves based off of race. And African slaves did not have the same rights in Jamestown or in the Virginia colonies as indentured servants. And that's something that I think that's really important. Also, for African slaves, this is not a willing process. Let's understand, they're taken from their homes thousands of miles away in West Africa, shipped across the ocean in the Middle Passage, right? Triangular trade. We'll get into this in the next video. But keep in mind, you're talking 20 to 30% of people on those ships are going to die at times, and it's a really tragic process. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But let's look at an indentured servant's tale. I think this quote gives you kind of an idea of how bad it was. And this is from Richard Frethorn, and it's in 1623. He came over and he's writing back to his parents. And he's writing about how horrible it is, about how people have died that he knows. And he then says this, and I have nothing to comfort me, nor there is nothing to be gotten here but sickness and death, except that one had money to lay out in some things for profit. But I have nothing at all. No, not a shirt to my back, but 2 rags, nor no clothes, but 1 poor suit, nor but 1 pair of shoes, but 1 pair of stockings, button 1 cap, and but 2 bands. My cloak was stolen by one of my fellows, and to his dying hour, he would not tell me what he did with it. And what Richard is talking about here is the fact that he has nothing. He came over with things. And what indentured servants would do is some of them would come over with luggage and property and everything else. They would have to barter that off for food because they are starving. He talks about them basically shackling together pennies to buy bread and everything else. And it's a really horrible process. And so it was not easy for indentured servants. And as Frethorn talks about, a lot of them died in the early stages of this colony. Now, African Americans as well being thrusted into this creates a lot of issues going forward. And as slavery expands into the Virginia territories, it becomes a way of life for Virginia plantation owners. And they get more and more slaves. They're going to rely less and less on indentured servants and more on African slaves, largely because one can be purchased for life and one is purchased for a limited time. In another video, I may get into the slave economy and everything else, but I think it's important to make sure we draw those distinctions. So let's turn our direction north to the northern colonies, and specifically, let's look at Massachusetts, right? The Pilgrims, or the Puritans, are going to come over in 1620. Now, why are they coming over? Because they're being persecuted in England. They're not very well liked. There's a lot of reasons for this. Part of it is the dogma of their version of Christianity, and then the other parts are the dogmas of the other versions of Christianity. England is a hot mess of Protestant things. It's a huge Protestant Reformation area. Obviously, the Church of England, but then all of the little offshoots of that as well. And the Puritans believed they had a purer form of life, a better form of life. They wanted to come form a shining city on a hill. And so as they come across, this is going to be the Mayflower, right? Mayflower Compact. And they're going to come across, and you get William Bradford. And the Mayflower Compact, I think, is really important. And you can kind of see some of the words from it here. But what they're trying to do is establish a colony and then establish their own government from that colony. Now, that government will still be subject to the king, right? They're still going to listen to the King of England. However, they agree to meet in an assembly and elect officials to form their government each year. And Bradford, of course, who helped design this, is going to be elected 30 times in a 35-year period of time. Takes a couple years off here and there. Now, the Puritans formed this in the Shining City on a Hill is based on their religion. Now, while the Puritans came for religious freedom, that doesn't mean they actually believed in religious freedom for everybody. And this tends to be the case for a lot of these colonies, is they don't actually practice religious freedom when it comes to all citizens. And one big case I think that is really important is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is a fascinating figure when you look at her. And, she's sitting here and she starts to host meetings of various people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And she begins to kind of develop her own version of Christianity. She believed that, the salvation and scripture and everything else could be interpreted. And Anne Hutchinson is going to get vilified for this in Massachusetts Bay. She's actually going to be put on trial. And she has some great quotes. Obviously, you have power over my body, but the Lord Jesus has power over my body and soul. And then she goes forward to say that if they, essentially kill her, that they're going to be damned forever. Well, Anne Hutchinson's actually going to be kicked out of the Massachusetts colony, and she will go to Rhode Island, where she'll help form a new colony. Her and her family eventually will be killed by natives in a raid. But long story short, religious freedom didn't always mean religious freedom. And I think that's really important. A lot of these colonies, as they're established for specific religions, only want those specific religions. And depending on which group is coming to which area, that can be different. A lot of people talk about, in particular, Pennsylvania with Quakers coming in, and how the early Quakers were very much against slavery at times. And was this the first abolitionism? I don't quite think you can go that far, but it is the early stages of it. Anne Hutchinson, for instance, standing up to the Puritans and saying that she doesn't agree with the interpretation of Adam and Eve, that Eve is the ultimate distraction for Adam, and that she's the reason why he does the things that he does. These are all really important questions. Now, at the end of the day, the important thing that we have to understand is that these colonies are all established for different reasons. In the north, primarily, you're looking at colonies that will be centered around economic trade. They'll be centered around shipping off some materials and more shipping, if you will. In the south, these colonies are going to be financial in basis. And in the next video, that's what we're going to touch upon, is the economic system that these colonies develop over the course of 100 years. And that'll be the next video. So thank you for watching. And that was Unit 2, Section 1. Thank you.